Hey, welcome back to Zilog and Moto, the channel where I attempt to provide a historical voice to the 8 and 16-bit Sega era, from someone who was there and has seen all these games age, some well and some not so well. We're breaking some new ground today on Zilog and Moto, as we take our first look at an action RPG for any of the four main consoles that get discussed around here. RPGs in general, whether they be action, JRPG, D&D, etc., are known for taking a while to play, which makes them difficult to work into the weekly schedule. There's technically not that many of them total, as the RPG genre in general was a battle that was lost to Nintendo pretty decisively in that era, but there are still a few that I need to work through, and some good ones, like the previously reviewed original Phantasy Star that I looked at way back in episode 4, about a year and a half ago. As a result of their general longer completion time, I've really got to have a strategy to work them in. I've actually just this week finally picked up a complete copy of Phantasy Star 2 with map and hint book, so later on this year I can get that one slotted in. By the way, that Phantasy Star 2 hint book is getting pretty hard to find, so you may want to start looking for a copy if you're interested. Just a quick tip. Also, there was someone on Etsy selling reproductions of it, so if it looks too good to be true, it might be. Anyway, the reason why I mentioned that planning aspect is because last week's review title, Dynamite Dux for the Master System, is notoriously short, so it provided a good opportunity to work in an RPG and really utilize that extra time in my schedule. Then the question became, well, which game should I pick to work on? Well, recently on Twitter, maybe a month or so ago, the topic of Sword of Vermilion came up. The guy in that thread posted how it was one of his favorite titles from the era. And without even really thinking about it, I responded with how I remembered it being a bit boring. But then I thought about it some more and realized, it's been a long time since I played that game. Maybe I'm forgetting some good things about it. So, guy on Twitter that I forget your name because I'm old, this week's review is specifically inspired by you. Sword of Vermilion is one of the oldest RPGs on the console, originally being released in Christmas of 1989 in Japan. In those days, many RPG titles didn't get brought to America due to the massive amounts of translation needed for all the text in the game to English. However, Sword of Vermilion was special due to being developed by Sega big man Yu Suzuki, so a little over a year later, in late January of '91, the game did actually make it to the United States. The game was somewhat of a special release, as a lot of RPGs were at the time, coming in at an oddly sized 5 megabit cartridge with battery backup, and also including its own hint book. No, not an extra thick manual. The hint book for Sword of Vermilion is a separate 106-page book to assist you in making through the game in those dark days before the internet. Nowadays, it's not really necessary, but the collectors out there are definitely going to want to pick it up. You may have noticed earlier how I've described this game as both an action RPG and just an RPG, and admittedly those are traditionally two different types of genres. But as you'll see, what makes Sword of Vermilion unique is that it takes elements of both of those styles and includes some dungeon crawling aspects as well. Does that combination work well when mixed together? Or should the designers have picked the lane and stuck with it? Well, we'll take a look at that and more. But first, a look at the package and the hint book. Okay, and here is Sword of Vermilion, and as you can tell by looking at the cover, as we've talked about previously on Zilog and Moto, this is one of those second-generation Genesis cover art releases, as the art doesn't go all the way to the edge, like in the European release. I'll insert that cover real quick so you can see how it compares, and actually looking at that release, they seem to have screwed up a bit, as they blew the image up too much, and now it's oddly cropped. And then of course Japan got a wildly different cover with just the title of Vermilion. One interesting note that I just realized this week when playing through the game again, every version of the game features a horse on the cover, but there's no horses in the game. It doesn't really matter, but when I realized it, it was definitely one of those, hey, wait a minute moments. One other quick note about the cover art, for the logo, they actually used a red color for Vermilion, which is appropriate and something I appreciate. They also used a similar bright red for the hilt of the sword, I guess indicating that the cover is you holding said sword, which is a nice touch as well. Vermilion is not an overly well-known shade of color outside of artists and painters, Although it is the title of a Slipknot song, and as I found out when researching this review, a town in Pokemon apparently. Not exactly my strong suit. Anyway, the outer cover of the box is in good shape, minus a small bunch on the front, and then also the hang tab has been removed. The inner cover is near perfect, and I don't see any edge wear, water damage, or sun damage, which is nice. Flipping over to the back, someone did mark a line in the barcode, I guess indicating that it shouldn't be used, or something. The rest of the rear cover uses the traditional early Genesis format with one large screenshot and then two smaller ones below. I like the ones they chose too, and they're all of good quality. Each screenshot shows a different aspect of the game, with the primary one showing off the boss battle view, and then shots below showing the town and world views. The only thing left out is normal combat, but you'll see plenty of that in a second. The flavor text on the side is pretty standard, but I do have to call out one thing. It mentions be ready for hundreds of hours of adventure, and that's just not true. Maybe if you play through the game a few times, but realistically, even without the hint book, you'll probably be done in about 30 hours. Moving on to inside the box, the cartridge is in good shape and the manual is in almost mint condition. I don't think I realized it was in this good a condition when I purchased it. The manual isn't the largest thing in the world, but it packs a ton of information into its pages. There's lots of screenshots that explain the menus in the game, and then also detailed charts for all purchasable items, like weapons and magic. If you have this, but not the hint book, it's certainly not the end of the world. And now the hint book. It's about the same height as the clamshell, but a little thinner. The outer cover is laminated to protect it, and it's starting to just barely come off the edge, so I always try to be very careful when touching that. Other than that, the binding is intact, and no marks on the pages, which is great. All the pages are in full color, and it starts out with a reference guide to the various items and spells before getting into the step-by-step guide through the game. The hint book isn't perfect, however, as I've found a few pieces of armor and weapons that aren't covered, and the dungeon maps don't show where things are in a dungeon, instead just giving a list of what to look for. And I guess technically it is listed as just being a hint book and not a full strategy guide, but just keep that in mind. On some of the larger dungeons, you may be having to go to the internet for backup unless you're mapping the whole thing out yourself with graphing paper. Okay, well that's the package. Let's get on to exploring the world of Vermilion. As a rule, when designing a product, any kind of product, you always want to focus on one specific aspect of that product. The more care and thought you can put into that one aspect, the better it will be, and the better it will stand up to public scrutiny. What many developers have a hard time with is that they end up with this giant wall of ideas, and then they try to cram all those ideas into said product, and each of those ideas is usually geared towards trying to appeal to a specific viewpoint. Some people think certain things are important, some prefer others, so the more things you can include, the more amounts of people that you can appeal to. However, that line of thinking is in direct competition to trying to focus on that one specific aspect, as now you have multiple aspects that need care and thought and planning. Usually anything that tries to meet the needs of many ends up being weak in all of those various areas, and not particularly strong or useful in any one area. This mindset applies to game design as well, and it's the reason why there's not a ton of successful, truly multi-platform games. Instead, you see things like Brutal Legend, a game that tried to mix 3D action and real-time strategy, and unfortunately not being able to live up to the hype. The reason why I started this dissertation on game design is because Sword of Vermilion walks that dangerous line. I've got a hard time specifically categorizing it because of that. From the first look, with all the scenes of exploring different towns, talking to people, and various fetch quests, those are all standard, typical JRPG scenarios. But in most quote-unquote standard JRPGs, you explore the world just by freely walking around a world area, interrupted by the occasional monster encounter. Sword of Vermilion instead takes the town and dungeon concept from JRPGs, but instead adds in a specific grid environment, with a world based around 16 by 16 grids, much more akin to a traditional Dungeons & Dragons RPG instead. So now the question comes in, is it a JRPG or is it a more traditional RPG? But wait, There's more. Sword of Vermilion includes 2 battle systems, and both are action-based. So now, not only are we trying to answer the question of whether Sword of Vermilion is a traditional RPG versus a JRPG, but due to the game's unique battle system, is it actually an action RPG? And that's where I'm landing with the decision. Sword of Vermilion is a unique action RPG that also includes elements of traditional and Japanese RPGs. Okay, so having said that, does it fall into the trap of trying to do too many different things at once and not do any of them well? To an extent, yeah, it kind of does, but certain things work well, so I'll try to be specific about what works and what doesn't. Let's start out with the opening of the game. You name your character and enter the world of Vermilion in your hometown of Wycliffe. Your father, whom you soon find out isn't actually your father, surprise, surprise, is on his deathbed, and he relays this information to you, sending you out into the world on a quest to collect the 8 Rings of Good and take revenge on the evil Zarkon, who long ago collected the 8 Rings of Evil and killed your real dad to boot, just for you to have extra motivation to go on this quest, in case merely defeating evil wasn't enough to get your butt out the door. The plot of the game isn't overly complicated. Essentially, moving through the world of Vermilion, you go from town to town seeking out the 8 rings, and more often than not, each new village or town you get to has some sort of problem that you get to solve by going to a nearby cave or dungeon. Rinse and repeat for the 14 locales in the game. Towards the very end of the game, there is one I wouldn't even call curveball, but something you might not expect as part of the plot that gets added in to make your final confrontation with Zarkon even more important. But that's just it, and it feels tacked on and unnecessary. I guess it adds a nice bit of happy ending to the game, but it's just a microcosm for the rest of the game, where the story and NPCs in the game seem more of just a way to push you from the beginning of the game to the end, rather than actually engaging you or making you feel anything. No time during Sword of Vermilion did I feel like, man, this Zarkon guy is a bad dude, I've got to take him out. Or, I've got to collect these 8 rings to become all-powerful. In fact, the rings have no effect on the game. Even though each has a name, like the Ring of Earth or the Ring of Water, you gain no additional powers from the rings, and collecting the rings is instead just something you have to do. You could be collecting the 8 baseball cards of good for all that it really matters. And that titular Sword of Vermilion that you get at the end of the game, well, it is indeed the strongest sword in the game. But is there anything actually special about it? No, not really. There's no in-game lore about it, or even any magical abilities. It's just a powerful sword that technically you can easily miss and finish the game without it. From a positive perspective, the game is well translated without any typos that I saw, and no English with all the text actually making sense. With the 14-month lead time between the Japanese release and the English release, you'd expect that they would have enough time to work all that out, and they did. I point this out because many other Japanese-sourced RPGs do have this problem, even big budget titles like the Final Fantasy series. So I did want to be fair to Sega, and that while the overall story behind the Sword of Vermilion is a bit bland, Sega at least put a decent level of effort into bringing the game over. Moving on from the plot, the very first thing I noticed about the game is the soundtrack. When loading up the game initially, the intro theme plays on the title screen as you choose to either start a new game or continue a saved one, and that theme, along with thunderous sound effects, sounds phenomenal, especially for a game coded in 1989. This great sound continues throughout the rest of the game with multiple different background tracks depending on where you're at, if it's the greater world, a city, or even what type of building you're in. The game doesn't have quite the same level of sound effects, with most battles ending up sounding exactly the same, but the ones included are of good quality. And if you want, there's also a sound test to allow you to put your speakers through their paces, which is a nice bonus. Graphically, I must say I was surprisingly impressed by the game as well. By no means is Sword of Vermilion near the top of the charts for Genesis games graphically. However, when you take into consideration just how old the game is, and the things that it does well regardless of age,
it definitely deserves to be called out and recognized for that. When visiting towns in-game, you won't notice anything special except for a strange bug that causes certain NPCs and yourself to appear to have green faces. I did some research, and this green face bug also apparently occurs in later releases of the game and collections on more modern systems. So to be clear, it's not just the gear or television that I was using to play the game. Instead of the graphics in towns, dungeons, or the overworld, which are all fine, the graphics that I found the most impressive were in both elements of the battle mode. In the standard battle mode, which you will spend a lot of time in, your character will face up to 8 enemies. While you don't have a lot of variety in the specific battles, because they all have to be the same type of foe, each of the types of enemies feature great pixel art, and the game uses the Genesis 64 color on-screen limit to its utmost potential. The game utilizes palette swapping to indicate different enemies' strengths, as was common in the era, but all of the palette swaps use good color schemes to keep things unique and visually appealing. The boss battle mode also features some nice, very large enemies, making the boss battles that much more entertaining. Even though the game features solid music and graphics for its era, its gameplay leaves a bit to be desired. As is standard for an RPG, your goal of progressing through the game is only attainable by going out into the world and exploring dungeons in an effort to level up your character, whereby you become stronger, gain more hit points, etc. And of course, you also earn money by these exploits, which in turn you can use to purchase stronger weapons, armor, magic spells, and items. All pretty standard things by RPG terms. The problem comes with the method in which you fight the battles with enemies to earn those things. As mentioned before, the reason why I consider the game to be an action RPG is because instead of a regular RPG, your ability to progress through the game is controlled by how well you can control the action sequences with the enemies. Whereas in a straight RPG, usually you just press buttons to tell your character what to do. As you explore the game world in Sword of Vermilion, randomly you get into battles with various types of enemies, from 1 to 8 of that specific enemy. When this occurs, you are automatically transported into an empty field or dungeon area, where you walk around and hit the C button to slash your sword at enemies, or press A to use a rated magic spell. And this process gets repeated over and over and over again. The enemy encounter rate in the game is pretty high, making trudging from location to location a chore, and unfortunately you can't purchase a spell to teleport to cities you've already visited until about halfway through the game. The encounter rate is so high that about 80% of the way through the game, my character was already maxed out, and I spent the rest of the game just running away from battles because it was quicker. The game really could have used some better balancing here, by either granting more levels for your character, making it harder to level up, or most simply, just reducing the random encounter rate so you're not tripping over enemies to go from place to place. There are other little things that are somewhat annoying as well, such as not getting a decent healing spell until late in the game, having magic in general be more or less unnecessary unless you want to spend more time walking back and forth between towns, and this is super minor, but it bugged me, having the actual Sword of Vermilion from the title of the game be just another item, and then in battle sequences it appears blue like normal, instead of, Vermilion. Even with the fact that I have issues with the game's leveling system, and that combat could have been better, the dangers of trying to do too many different things that I alluded to earlier, I'm going to give Sword of Vermilion 3 stars, due to its place in history and the fact that it's one of the oldest games on the Mega Drive. Yes, there's much better RPGs that have come out since then, but from a retro gaming perspective, taken through the lens in 1989, Sword of Vermilion was a very innovative take on the RPG genre, and I can guarantee you've probably never played a game like it on the whole. Is it for everyone? No, probably not. But if you enjoy dungeon crawlers, this title should definitely be on your list.
And that was Sword of Vermilion, an ambitious title with more than a few flaws, but that also does a lot of things right and served to provide a look into what could be possible on the new Mega Drive Genesis platform. It didn't have the impact in the United States that it could have if it had been released in 1989 like the Japanese version was, but that shouldn't take away from the respect that it deserves. This was one of those situations where I played the game 25 years ago or so, and I thought it was just okay, so it's been nice to be able to take a second look at the title with a set of older and hopefully wiser eyes. Although, some days I don't know about that last bit. Tune in next week when we stay on the Genesis, as I try to get my fingers limbered up for some platforming action, with a title that I have fond memories of from back in the day, and was actually one of the first games I ever picked up from the flea market, back when GameStop, or as it was then, Electronics Boutique, had just started taking used games. Based on this week's look at Sword of Vermilion and my change in viewpoints on that title, I'll be very interested to see if my views on this title have changed at all. Remember, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other.